Good afternoon. I hope that you are enjoying the snowy afternoon that we're having. And of course, I know that you set aside time to work on your internal assessment. In today's video, I'm going to present instructions about the internal assessment to provide further guidance in 3 segments. The first segment will be clarification on the kind of question that you should be formulating as of now. What I'm going to do first is hold up the question, how I've broken down the question, and then the kind of research that I'm going to conduct in order to investigate it. Then I'm going to pull the card back, the whiteboard back, so that I can read it to you. All right, so here is my question. This is the question I'm going to investigate. Notice the language. This kind of language would allow me to investigate an analytical response to it. And then notice how I've broken down the key components of the question, and then observe the kind of research that I'm going to conduct, including primary and secondary source documents. All right, so now I'm going to read this question. In what way and with what result did Lenin deviate from Marxism to plan the November 1917 revolution in Russia? That is not a topic that we studied in class. It is not a question or a topic that you will be able to answer on the IB exams in May. I'm presenting this as a sample question. Right? So it's not a topic that you're going to explore. At this point, you pretty much have decided on what topic you're going to investigate. Right? So this is an example. All right, so the key components of this question: in what way did Lenin deviate from Marx? And then what was the result of that deviation, if indeed it deviated significantly? So I have to find an answer to this question, and I have to come to a reasoned conclusion about it. So I don't have any predetermined outcomes that I'm looking for. I'm going to let the research answer the question. So, in what way did Lenin deviate from Marx? Well, I need to have some primary sources here. And the first one that I'm going to read, the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx. Yes, let's go on the dark side and read up on some communism. Now, this particular edition of the Communist Manifesto includes an introduction from Eric Hobsbawm. Hobsbawm is a left-wing historian, and no, I am not a communist. But anyway, I'm going to use that introduction to get some insight into how historians have assessed the manifesto. There's not enough here from Hobsbawm for me to use as analysis in section 2, but it gives me an idea of how historians have interpreted Marx. And in fact, when I'm looking through secondary sources, I probably want to read more deeply into Hobsbawm's work. He's an expert on this topic. 19th century manifestos, revolution. I probably want to keep him on my list of historians to research. All right, so here's one. But then another primary source that I probably want to have in my possession, or primary sources, would be writings from Vladimir Lenin himself, in which he explains his deviation from Marx's work and why it was necessary in Russia. So that's where I want to go with my primary sources. My secondary sources would then help me to get perspective on how and why did Lenin decide to deviate from Marx. So notice on the whiteboard, I'm going to look up or research secondary sources that compare and contrast Marx and Lenin, and perhaps even see if I can dig up what would be considered an orthodox view. For example, Hobsbawm, his writings, his time of writing in history, he's old, he's gone, he's passed away. But it certainly would be more of an orthodox view. Any Russian history from the Soviet perspective would be orthodox opinions on or perspectives on Lenin and how he deviated from Marx. But since the Cold War, there has been some revision in Russian history. The Cold War ended, and a lot of the archives in the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, were opened up. So historians were able to go back and revise the Orthodox view. So I want to research maybe the Orthodox views. That would be Hobsbawm. He probably wrote his work in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And then what's recent? What are the recent perspectives on Lenin and why he deviated from Marx? So that's one part of my question. The second component of my question, Lenin deviated from Marx. What was the result? What was the outcome? I know there was a revolution in November 1917. Was that deviation necessary? Was it successful? I don't know. It was a revolution, but what was the result of that deviation, and did it create any problems for Marx as he was planning the revolution? I don't know. I want to find the answer. So my primary sources would probably include eyewitnesses to the revolution, other revolutionaries, definitely maybe Trotsky, other members of the Bolshevik movement and how they viewed Lenin and his deviation from Marx. So those would be the primary sources I would want to look for when I'm gathering my sources. And then I definitely want historians to weigh in on this question. Lenin deviated from Marx to plan the revolution in November of 1917, and there was one. But what did that mean in the planning stages of it? What did Lenin have to do in order to pull this off? He deviated from Marx. I want perspectives. Again, I want what's considered the orthodox view, the traditional view, and this would be from the older school of historians, maybe even Soviet historians themselves, who wrote about the revolution during the Soviet period, during the Cold War. And then I want to see if there's any updated views on the results of this deviation from current historians, maybe a revisionist view. All right, so, and I'm mapping this out based on the question that I've presented. Right, the way you would map out your own research needs to fit your question. Don't use this as a template and then struggle with doing your research when in fact this mapping wouldn't be appropriate for your question. So keep that in mind. But I've mapped out a plan, here it is, that's appropriate for my question. So now in the next segment, I'm going to go through the process of selecting sources, identifying and evaluating sources in section 1. So stay tuned.
A few moments later.
So welcome back to episode 2 of IA Day on a snowy day. And I know that you are working very hard on your internal assessment. So in my first segment, I presented a question, I broke it down, and I mapped out the kind of research that I need to conduct for that question. Your mapping of your research will probably look different than mine. So now I'm going to move on to section 1, identification and evaluation of sources. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to hold up the whiteboard and I'm going to present one way that you can identify and evaluate sources. Here it is. Right? So now I'm going to review one possible way that I could identify and evaluate my sources. Since this is a question that is driven by ideologies, one of them the Communist Manifesto, I think it's a good idea for me to identify and evaluate the manifesto as one source because my question is being driven by ideologies and deviations from the gospel of Marx. So I'm going to identify the Communist Manifesto as one of my sources, and I'm going to go through the OPCVL process. And I must pull out the values of the Communist Manifesto, this source, with reference to its origin, reference to its purpose, and reference to its content. I'm going to do the same thing with limitations. What are the limitations of this source with reference to its origin, with reference to its purpose, with reference to its content? One limitation would be, I don't know how the revolution One limitation, of course, the manifesto doesn't really tell me the impact that it had on historical events, right? Because this was written in 1848, and this is before the Age of Revolution in 1848. It was before the Communist Revolution in Russia in 1917. The manifesto doesn't really give me that answer. So, in order to address that limitation, I would probably want to seek out a secondary source that presents either an orthodox or revisionist view of the Marxist manifesto and Lenin's deviation from it, right? So if I use the orthodox view, if I identify a secondary source that takes the orthodox view, and I go through OPCVL, a limitation on the value of that source is that it does present an orthodox view. It was written from a Soviet perspective or written from a left-wing perspective in the 1940s or 50s. I want to see how historians have revised that view on the Communist Manifesto and how Lenin deviated from it. And of course, in my identification and evaluation of my sources, I want to make it very clear that these two sources, I've identified one, the primary source, the Communist Manifesto, this is definitely relevant to answering my question. It is the gospel of communist revolution. So I want to make it clear in my response, this source is relevant to my investigation, and I want to do the same thing with my secondary source. In fact, maybe even link the two. The primary source presents Marx's ideas. The secondary source explains how Lenin deviated from Marx, and maybe I've identified an orthodox view or a revisionist view, right? And the same thing, I want to be explicit that this secondary source is relevant to the question because the historian takes a perspective on how the manifesto and its deviations was critical to the planning of the November 1917 revolution. I want to make that very clear. So I need analytical sources. I need sources from historians when I'm selecting my secondary source. I do not want thick narratives. The history of the world since the beginning of time probably will not present an analytical response to my question. I would not identify that as a source to evaluate. That's a source I could put in my source list. You know, if you have a narrative on the Russian Revolution with a chronology of events, well, you need that in order to answer the question. I would need that to answer my question. I want to know a chronology of events. I want to have a narrative of what happened, but I'm going to identify that as a source that I use in my source list. I am not going to identify that and evaluate it as a source that is critical to answering my question, because I need analytical work. I need the work of historians. I need perspective. I need the primary sources that allow me to compare and contrast the two views, the Marx and Lenin. Those are the sources I want to identify and evaluate, not the narratives, not the chronologies, the sources that allow me to analyze and answer to my question. So the second way I could go about this I could also identify two secondary sources. And one secondary source would present the orthodox view, the traditional view, or the Soviet view. And the second source could also be secondary, and this would be the revisionist work that I've discovered through my research process. Again, I want to be very explicit. I'm going to be very explicit that these are relevant sources to my investigation because I want to come to a reasoned conclusion. Where do historians stand now on Lenin's deviation from Marx? And maybe the revisionist view supports the orthodox view with some changes or some revisions. And we've encountered this when we've read Williamson and we've looked at the traditional view and how some historians have actually tweaked that a bit 90 years later or 70 years later, or how historians have now rejected the traditional view and have embraced a different point of view. And as time passes, as historians encounter primary source documents that were recently discovered or declassified, that allows them to revise their traditional viewpoints. And again, I want to perhaps even connect the orthodox and revisionist view. If my limitation here is that the orthodox view may be outdated and has been revised, then I identify a revisionist view. And of course, my limitation here is I want to know if other historians support the revisionist view. Or are there still schools of historians, is there still a school of thought out there that still supports the orthodox view? All right, so those are the limitations I would observe for my question. Right? Again, avoid templating. I'm not giving you a template. I'm giving you direction on how you could approach these sections of the paper. Right? Your question may take in a different direction in regard to identifying and evaluating sources. Okay, so don't think that I'm giving you a template and you just drop in your answer. That's not going to work. All right, so that's the end of my second segment. One more segment to go, and that's section 2, investigation. See you in a minute.
A few moments later.
Welcome back. And so now my last segment will give some direction for section 2 of the internal assessment, and that would be section 2, investigation. That is what that section is called, and it's still snowing outside. It's a beautiful day. So after I'm done, I'm going to go out and play in the snow because I've been working all day long on my internal assessment. I'm going to take a break. So I'm going to hold up the whiteboard. All right. And I'm going to read to you what I have on here, and then I'm going to explain. So now I'm working on section 2, investigation. And of course, for your February 9th deadline, you are only submitting 600 words. And that will give me a peek as to how you're answering your question. So this is where I answer my question. In what way and with what results did Lenin deviate from Marxism to plan the November 1917 revolution in Russia? In my investigation, I'm going to constantly link in what way and with what results. The revolution in Russia, 1917. That linkage is critical because I want to find an answer to in what way did Lenin deviate from Marx and how did that impact his planning of the revolution. He didn't do this on his own, to ultimately overthrow the provisional government in Russia. Of course, that was the ultimate result, was that Lenin was successful in overthrowing that government in November of 1917, despite that deviation. So I want to link the ways in which he deviated and the results, and I want to come to a conclusion as to how that happened. All right, so I'm going to use evidence from a variety of sources, various sources, primary and secondary source documents. They're critical to answering my question. I'm going to interpret my evidence, or I'm going to analyze, I'm going to explain the ways in which Lenin deviated from Marx. I'm going to explain how that affected the planning and the results which led to revolution. I'm going to explain all of that using my various sources. And I am then going to weave in the opinions of historians who hold a traditional point of view. I'm going to evaluate that traditional perspective, and then I'm going to then introduce the revisionist view, right? So it may be something along the lines of the orthodox view of Lenin's deviation from Marx and its impact is this. However, since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, documents have been released to suggest a different perspective on Lenin's deviation and what that meant in planning the revolution and, of course, the revolution itself in November of 1917. So I want to also remember that I am presenting perspective as well as an analysis of an answer to my question. I want to come to a reasoned conclusion. So if my evidence and my evaluation of perspective indicates that the revisionist view is the accepted view, that historians have now rejected, the school of historians on this matter have rejected the traditional view. And now historians generally agree that the revisionist view best explains how Lenin deviated from Marx, why it was necessary, how did that impact the planning, and then it ultimately led to a successful overthrow of the provisional government. I want to come to that conclusion as I finish Section 2 investigation. But I'm also going to internally cite my sources. Every time I use the Communist Manifesto, for example, I might be paraphrasing. I might be directly quoting. I might be citing Hobsbawm's introduction. Regardless of how I am using that source, even if I am not quoting, even if I am paraphrasing, I must cite it. Okay? There are two ways you can cite your source. You can use, we're all using MLA format. We're all going to be consistent in that way. You can either footnote your sources or you can parenthetically cite your sources. Both methods have MLA formatting involved. So even parenthetical citation, I did include a link to the Purdue University site that gives very detailed directions on how to use footnoting, endnoting, and it should provide, I'll double check, but it should provide also instructions on how to parenthetically cite your sources. Whichever method you choose, either footnoting or parenthetical citation, you must use that one method throughout the paper. You cannot mix the two. You cannot footnote here and parenthetically cite over there. You can't do it. So don't. Okay? MLA is the only format I will consider. I don't want to see anything else. We're all being consistent. All right. Now, Chicago Manual of Style is the preferred method for history papers. It really doesn't matter. It's technically not that different. I got through graduate school just fine with MLA formatting, and I think we'll be okay with that. I just want us to be consistent. All right. So anything else that you've made up or concocted or you found on some blog or website somewhere, skip it. Go to the Purdue website. That's where you get the directions you need. Okay. I'm going to finish with one more thing, and that is I'm going to show you what parenthetical citation looks like. And I'll be honest with you, when I was in graduate school, I did 2 non-thesis options using parenthetical citation. When I was in undergrad, professors insisted that we use footnoting. So when you go off to university next year, it's probably will vary from professor to professor, which method you will have to use. This is good practice. And I'll explain why maybe one method might be better than the other. Again, it depends on your paper. So let's say that I am going to parenthetically cite my sources. It looks like this. And that's it. The author's last name and the page number where I got that information. All right, that's pretty easy. If I am paraphrasing or quoting and I begin my sentence with, so if I'm beginning my sentence with Hobsbawm argued, and then I quote from Hobsbawm, if that's the historian I'm using, then I simply put the page number after the quote that I've taken from the source. I just put the page number. It looks like something like this. All right. The problem with parenthetical citation is that if I hit that 1,300 word count limit in section 2, I don't have anywhere else to go if I feel as though I need to actually explain something, some evidence in section 2. So footnoting allows me to include explanatory notes in the footnote at the bottom of the page where you do the footnoting. Maybe I had to edit out some content because it was important to the investigation, but I was hitting that word count, and that was what I could put on the cutting room floor. When I edited my paper, that was something I could delete, but I still think it's important, so I can send the reader to the footnote, and then I read and explain that explanatory note that I had to delete from section 2. Use that judiciously. Do not put explanatory notes for 40 footnotes. They won't be read, and in fact, you will lose points for doing that. So it should be used sparingly and wisely. That is the advantage for endnoting, and it may be the advantage for this paper, for this internal assessment. Remember, you can't go over 2,200 words, and you might be hitting some word limits, and you want to consider where you can put some more content if it's needed. In the next segment, I'm going to go through appendixed information, if that's what you think you need to include, and of course, the all-important source list. And yes, you must give me a bibliography. It must be alphabetized, and it must be in an MLA format that is universally used by all of us. I'm going to go out and play in the snow. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Bye.